Okay, guys, we're back, and we are talking now about neurotransmitters and specific neurotransmitters. Um, in the previous videos, we talked about now both the structure and the function of neurons and how neurotransmission works. And that we talked about that there are two types of neurotransmissions or neurotransmitters, really excitatory and inhibitory. Um, if these things are unfamiliar to you, go back and watch the previous video. But for this video, we're going to be talking about two types of chemical messengers in particular: neurotransmitters and drugs. Neurotransmitters and drugs. So let's get into that and talk about different types of neurotransmitters. So remember, each type of neurotransmitter essentially has its own shape. And that shape is directly connected to the shape of the receptor sites of the receiving neuron. Okay. So, uh, a neurotransmitter like dopamine is released. Let's just say it has a triangular shape, just for the sake of argument. It lands perfectly in a triangular shaped receptor site. That then causes the receiving neuron to open its ion channels and make it more likely to fire an action potential. Um, Most neurotransmitters have what are called pathways. So there's the, oh man, I always struggle saying this, dopaminergic pathway, which is the dopamine pathway. There's a serotonin pathway in the brain. And this is basically just connections of neurons that, release these neurotransmitters specifically. Most neurotransmitters are released or most neurons have only really one type of neurotransmitter in them. That is why the connections are so important, right? So if we're talking about, one neuron could be connected to 20, maybe even like a few thousand other neurons through the, connections between dendrites and terminal buttons, you're going to be receiving a lot of different, neurotransmitters telling you what to do. So again, that's where the soma comes in and tallies all the score, and then kind of makes the decision if it's past the threshold to uh, fire or not. So let's talk about the specific neurotransmitters, because this is an important thing here. So here's a table with six. These are six of the most common ones. This is an important table for you to have. If it's not in your book, you should definitely, pause this video now to take this down in your notes. It is that important. You will need to know the function and examples of malfunctions of each of these for our test and for the AP exam. So it is very, very, very important that you know this information. So first up, let's kind of walk through these kind of quickly. This is just stuff you need to memorize. Acetylcholine, which is the first one there, otherwise known as ACH. ACH is a major neurotransmitter associated with a few things: muscles, learning, and memory. Okay. ACH is implicated in Alzheimer's disease. So people with low levels of ACH, or neurons that produce ACH, start to deteriorate, causing Alzheimer's, right, which is an issue with learning and memory. Um, Too much ACH can cause things like tremors and shakes, because, again, muscle action, right? So ACH, you're going to need to know too much of it and too little of it, what could cause it. Dopamine. Dopamine is the main rewarding um, uh, neurotransmitter. It basically is what makes people feel good. It is associated with feelings of pleasure, and usually is released when something happens that we really enjoy. This could be learning something, attention to something, right? You're paying attention, you're learning. Dopamine is all associated there. Now, we know that too much dopamine causes schizophrenia, and too little dopamine causes Parkinson's. So a lot of times, there's issues with both types of disorders, um, and the medication that they're on. So some medication increases dopamine, right? So that would be for someone with Parkinson's. but it can sometimes cause schizophrenic-like symptoms. There's a drug out right now for people with Parkinson's disease, and it's aimed at people who are taking medication but are hallucinating sometimes, or are having delusions in their thoughts. That is a result of having too much dopamine. Same thing with schizophrenia. Some of the medication that blocks dopamine, right, in the brain, because there's too much, your body's producing too much of it. Blocking that excess dopamine can cause Parkinson-like symptoms. So people can sometimes have tremors related to just being on a dopamine blocker. Serotonin is usually linked with depression and mood. Serotonin does a lot of other things as well, but if you don't have enough of it, it usually is a sign of depression. Drugs that treat depression are one of the things they do is they boost serotonin absorption in the nervous system, which then can help with mood and balance out serotonin levels. Serotonin is also released when you exercise. So if you've ever had a runner's high, that is your body being flooded with serotonin. Norepinephrine is arousal. So that's like if something alarming happens or something causes a kind of like a burst of adrenaline, right? Norepinephrine and adrenaline are very similar. So norepinephrine is kind of that your adrenaline's kicking, your heart's racing type of neurotransmitter. Now, all of these are excitatory, by the way, for the most part, except for GABA. GABA is a main inhibitory neurotransmitter, which means it's meant to slow things down. So you can think that if you don't have enough of it, that can cause things like restlessness or tremors or other types of things that are related to your body kind of moving too much or things going too fast. And finally, glutamate, that's really associated with memory. An oversupply can actually cause migraines, which is why some people try not to eat MSG. People who are especially sensitive, that's monosodium glutamate. So some people have reactions to that by finding it in food. So those are the 6 main ones. We'll talk about other ones throughout the year. We'll talk about oxytocin a little bit. But for now, those are the 6 main neurotransmitters that you're going to need to know what they do and what happens if there's too much or too little. Now, neurotransmitters are chemical messengers, right? I've said that a bunch of times already. There's a big difference between neurotransmitters and drugs. Okay, and the biggest difference here, the only difference really, is one is produced by the body and one is foreign to the body. Okay, so a neurotransmitter, your brain is just producing them, regularly as a normal product of function. But drugs are something that are like ingested or brought into the body somehow that is otherwise foreign. Just like there are 2 types of neurotransmitters, excitatory and inhibitory, there are also 2 types of drugs that basically do the same thing. But this is really important that we understand this and get this straight. When we're talking about drugs, again, we're talking about things that are brought in from outside the body. Just like neurotransmitters, all drugs affect the synapse. That is where drugs have their prevalence. Okay, they get in through the blood-brain barrier and they start flooding synapses with their chemical messengers. Right, that's one of the things why drugs are effective, is because the terminal ends and the synapses are not connected. Right, there's a gap there, so it can flood in through the cerebrospinal fluid and bind itself to receptor sites, tricking the brain into thinking that it is a neurotransmitter. Okay, so that's actually one type of drug. So let's talk about those. So when we're talking about drugs, we don't talk about excitatory and inhibitory. We talk about things called agonists and antagonists. Okay, an agonist mimics a neurotransmitter. Okay, I'll say that again. An agonist mimics a neurotransmitter. So alcohol is a drug. When people drink alcohol, it is synthesized into a chemical in your brain that looks. Remember, I said that neurotransmitters all have a certain shape. it looks and fits into the dopamine receptor sites in our reward circuits, right? Remember, dopamine is the feel good uh, chemical, right? So when people drink, the reason why it makes them feel good is because the dopamine is binding into those receptor cells, causing the brain to think that there's more dopamine there, and causing that feelings of pleasure, of rewarding, behaviors and those kinds of things. So an agonist mimics a neurotransmitter. Okay, in this case, alcohol mimics dopamine. Most addictive drugs mimic dopamine receptors. So alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine, all mimic dopamine receptors. Um, Morphine, right? So morphine, heroin, other opiates mimic endorphins, which is a painkiller uh, um, neurotransmitter, which actually we didn't talk about in the last slide. Endorphins basically are, your body's natural pain defense. So if you've ever seen someone who's like played a football game on a broken leg, they didn't realize they broke their leg, and that didn't feel pain. It's because endorphins were released in the process, preventing the body from feeling pain. So morphine mimics endorphins, right? So it is an agonist of an endorphin. ACH receptor agonists can help treat Alzheimer's disease. So again, you're tricking the body into thinking that there's more ACH here, so it dilutes the effect of the Alzheimer's disease. So keep that in mind, right? That when we're talking about agonists, we're talking about mimicking a neurotransmitter, and that's really important here because there's if it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it mimics that as well. It's not always excitatory. So I need you guys to understand that when we're talking about agonists, the key word is not does it make the next neuron more likely or less likely to fire. The key word is does it mimic or block a neurotransmitter or what seems like a neurotransmitter. If it mimics the neurotransmitter, it's an agonist. If it blocks a neurotransmitter, it's an antagonist. And one of the most famous examples of this is a poison called curare. It's found in Central and South America. It is a poison that indigenous peoples have used on darts to go hunting. Basically, what it does is it's an antagonist for ACH. ACH is related to movement. Okay, so if an antagonist gets into the bloodstream and into the nervous system, it blocks the absorption of ACH. It basically plugs in the receptor site. So it prevents ACH from binding to the next neuron, preventing movement from happening. And movement's pretty important if we're talking about things like heartbeat and muscle movement and breathing, right? So it can cause paralysis and death. Other types of antagonists are sometimes called alpha blockers or beta blockers, which help treat blood pressure, right? People with high blood pressure. It's an antagonist. It blocks the chemical signals that signal for a higher blood pressure. Antipsychotic medication that's used to treat schizophrenia blocks dopamine. Okay, it's an antagonist for dopamine. So think of it as two ways. One is an agonist, right? The shape is so close to the actual neurotransmitter that it tricks the body into thinking that it is the neurotransmitter and causes the same effects, usually to an exponential degree. An antagonist is close enough for it to fit in the receptor site, but not close enough for it to trick the body. So what happens is the antagonist flood the synapse and plug in the receptor sites so that the neurotransmitter, whether it's ACH or dopamine or whatever, can't bind to the receptor site and therefore either gets reabsorbed or just floats away or gets broken down, and it prevents whatever that neurotransmitter was going to do. Again, remember, antagonist does not always mean that it slows things down. If it's an antagonist for an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it will speed things up, right? It will basically cut the brakes, if you want to think of it that way. So Those are neurotransmitters and drugs, right? Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers within the body that affect the synapse and make it either more or less likely that the receiving neuron will fire. Drugs are chemical messengers from outside of the body that either mimic or block neurotransmitters. So if they mimic a neurotransmitter, that's called an agonist. It makes the body think that there's more of that neurotransmitter there. If it blocks the absorption of a neurotransmitter, then it's called an antagonist. Again, very, very important terms here, guys. This unit is so vocab heavy. It's really important that you get all this stuff down. But we're going to stop now with here. Stop now here. What am I talking about? And we're going to, next video will be all about how the nervous system is broken down and how it's organized. So this seems like a perfect spot to stop, so we will. If you have any questions, you guys know to reach out about this. Again, I anticipate some questions here because there's a lot of information here. So take your notes, let me know what questions you have, and I'll see you guys in the next video.